Good evening. My name is Dr. Strittmatter. Some people call me Roger. Some people call me Doc Strittmatter. People call me lots of different names. In fact, yes, I'm right up there with Keir Cutler and the rest of the crazy Shakespeare loony bins who have studied the evidence carefully enough to realize that as of 2016 we are in a significantly advanced stage of what the historian of ideas would call a paradigm shift. We've been living with a 400-year-old piece of mythology about who Shakespeare was and what the relationship between his life and his works is. And I'm from that part of Shakespeare studies, the minority part, that has really dug into this and found out some very interesting things. Now, this is my first YouTube video. I hope to make many more. I'm not very technically expertise at this point, very technically expert. I don't have much technical expertise, but I'm learning as I go, and I primarily want to do just one thing in this first video. I want to introduce you to a publication that has just come out that has been produced in response to the Shakespeare Folger Library's 2016 Shakespeare First Folio tour. The Shakespeare First Folio, as many of you may know, is the 1623 publication that for the first time includes all of the collected works of Shakespeare. Well, all of them except for Pericles and possibly a few other plays which are now attributed to the author of the plays in the folio, but most of them, 36 of them, about half of which had not been published in any form before that. The folio tour put on by the Folger Library purports to be an objective enlightenment of the American public regarding the history of this physical object, the First Folio. This is our response to the folio tour. By our, I'm referring to myself, to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. See, I don't even know exactly what direction to go here. The Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship and the authors that have assembled their thoughts in this volume. Now, I'm going to review some, but not all of the articles. I'm just picking the ones that I think will give us a good sense of what's in here and can kind of create a useful narrative that will help us to understand why the Folger Library has done such a poor job of historically contextualizing this very important document. The first article in the volume is Branding the Author, Feigned Authorship Neutrality, and the First Folio Tour. This is by Shelley Maycock, and it is a very thorough and, to my way of thinking, profoundly disturbing analysis of exactly what the Folger has included in this tour and how they've gone about making sure that the things that they need to keep away from public notice have not been included in it. It is Ms. Maycock's conclusion that the principles and the protocols of the American Library Association, one of the co-sponsors of the tour, and possibly that of the Cincinnati Museum Center, another co-sponsor of the Folger tour, have been systematically violated in the manner in which the tour has been put together and presented to the public. Now, if I just might take one quick set of examples to illustrate what does that mean. How could this tour be in violation of traditional standards of objectivity that librarians and curators of museums are really obliged ethically and professionally to observe? Nothing in any of the Folger materials that we have seen, and I think that means that it doesn't exist, It's possible that we could have missed something. Only the Folger could tell us that. We have seen the name Ben Jonson, the name William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, Philip Herbert, Earl of Montgomery. None of those names are mentioned in the Folio tour materials. Now, this is astounding. The first folio is dedicated to the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery. They are usually thought to have been financial patrons of it. Ben Jonson is thought by most to have been the editor of the first folio. Certainly Oxfordians regard him as the editor. And there is nothing at all about any of those people. Hevings and Condell, on the other hand, who purport to be the authors of 2 dedicatory epistles in the folio, a claim that has been widely doubted even by Orthodox Shakespeareans, are mentioned. So there's a selective attention only to those details that the Folger thinks it can spin into its scenario about what the folio was all about, and a pretty systematic suppression of things that don't fit, including any mention of Jonson, Pembroke, or Montgomery. Let me show you a couple other articles in here. This is Shakespeare's Impossible Doublet by John Rollitt. Subtitled Droeshout's Engraving Anatomized. This article discusses in great detail the famous Droeshout engraving. There it is, of course, as it appears in the folio, and notes that for all kinds of reasons this engraving is even weirder and more bizarre in an original Jacobean context than it is in the modern world, something that Orthodox scholar Marjorie Garber, but Leah Marcus in Puzzling Shakespeare has also stated very forcefully. The next article is Richard Whalen's Look Not on This Picture, Ambiguity in the Shakespeare First Folio. The quote, of course, is from Jonson's 10-line epigram, which accompanies the Droeshout engraving, and explicitly tells the reader, after a few jesting lines about what the engraving depicts, that we should not look on the engraving, but instead on the book. An argument that is at best, from a Stratfordian point of view, a paradoxical one. Why would Jonson feel the need to do that? Well, anti-Stratfordians have been asking that question for quite a long time about Ben Jonson. That is, well, I use the term anti-Stratfordian and post-Stratfordian. Being a post-Stratfordian just means you've got beyond the addiction to the Stratford story and you realize there's a problem. Ben Jonson, as early as 1921, George Greenwood, writing about Ben Jonson as early as 1921, had very astutely summarized a lot of the evidence, even at that point in time, that Jonson was not saying what Orthodox Shakespeareans think he's saying in the First Folio. 2 more. Let me show you the first page here. I've got 3 short articles in here. I'm only going to show you one of them. Bestow, How and When You List, the De Vere's and the 1623 Shakespeare Folio. Well, it turns out that everywhere you look, the De Vere's are all over this scene. Well, I mentioned already, did I mention? I did not mention that the 2 noble brethren to whom the First Folio is dedicated, one of them, the younger, was married to Susan Vere. The elder brother, Pembroke, had previously been engaged to another De Vere daughter, Bridget. So that shows you how close these families really were, the De Vere's and the Herberts. They could not have been closer. And that closeness is underscored in a document reproduced here in this article, which reproduces a 1619 publication by William Jaggard dedicated to Pembroke and Montgomery and also to the Lady Susan Vere. That's the one with the big W, and the one with the small w is the dedication page from the 1623 First Folio. There are many reasons to think that the second title page, 4 years after the first one, is actually mimicking and echoing and alluding to the first. Why would it be doing that? Well, because it's telling us that there is a connection between these plays and Lady Susan Vere. Finally, an article by Bill Boyle, Shakespeare's Son on Death Row. I've mentioned the Pembrokes and the Montgomerys and the important relationship to Lady Susan Vere. The final piece of this puzzle that the folder has left out that is exceptionally important, and that's why they have very studiously not said anything about it, is that the folio comes out at a moment of real international crisis and civic and civil crisis within England. The country was on the brink of civil war over what was called the Spanish marriage crisis. That refers to the plan of King James to marry his oldest son Charles to the Infanta of Spain, who of course was Catholic. And so this marriage threatened the stability of Protestant England, at least from the point of view of many Protestants within the country. And they were quite upset about it. And there's a huge consternation going on. This became the biggest news story of the century, with multiple news pamphlets published in Spain, in England, and in other places in Europe. I didn't make that up. It's been called the greatest news story of the century by scholars who study it. Now, think of this. The folio comes out right in the middle of this, and moreover, as a document, it is impossible to allow it to escape from the surrounding context, for the simple reason that the Earl of Pembroke, in particular, accompanied by his younger brother, were two of the leading parliamentarian and popular opponents to the Spanish marriage, and therefore, exactly in 1623, were on the opposite side of this huge argument with the king. So who else was involved in that? This is where it gets really interesting. Another major opponent in the Spanish marriage crisis from the aristocracy was William Stanley, the Earl of Derby, the husband of the third de Vere daughter, Elizabeth. Also, the third Earl of Southampton was a strong part of this faction, a man whose associations with Shakespeare goes back at least until 1593. And finally, and really most interesting of all, we have the case of the 18th Earl of Oxford, Henry de Vere, who was the young radical in all of this bunch. He was jailed by King James for speaking out in Parliament against the marriage. And according to Peter Dixon's very insightful research on this question, he remained imprisoned in the Tower of London for almost precisely, give or take, a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. We're talking about a 17 or 18 month period approximately, if I recall correctly. It's many months. And he is in the Tower. He goes into the Tower. That's when the printing on the folio starts. He gets out of the Tower when the folio has been published. So all's well that ends well in that case. So I hope I've given you something to think about. Whatever you think about the authorship question, my purpose is to share information and to expand especially the wider public's knowledge of what they're not getting from the standard Shakespeare professoriate that is still operating in denial mode. So I hope you found this talk interesting. I look forward to the next one. I will, if I upload this to YouTube, I will allow comments, but here's the ground rules, folks. If your only purpose for making a comment is to be insulting, it will be deleted. If you have a legitimate question or an observation, or even if you want to argue, as long as it's polite, I will post your comment. I look forward to seeing you the next time around. Vero nihil variant.